Hi there, everybody, and welcome to the Hoover Library's annual Flash Fiction event. This event is our Write Club's formal, where members of our group get to showcase their talents and a bit of their creative writing with everyone. My name is Melanie, and I'll be your host today, introducing our guests and the pieces they'll be reading for you. We ask that you please turn off your camera and microphones for this event and just listen and express your appreciation in the comments or with the reaction emojis because we are recording this event and we want to cut down on bandwidth usage and background noise while our presenters are reading. We will be putting the video recording of this event up on our library's YouTube channel and website, and I will drop the links to those in the chat. If you'd like to learn more about our Write Club group, please email hoover.writeclub@gmail.com, visit the library's website at hooverlibrary.org, or call the fiction department at 205-444-7820. Thank you all for being here today and supporting your local writers. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Our first presenter today is going to be Jessica Nackery. She is going to be reading a selection from her memoir, Rooted and Rising. Jessica has been writing since a young age, from short stories and long fiction to nonfiction and term papers. She has spent most of her life immersed in the written word. These days, she spends most of her time wrangling 3 children and running her own business as a success coach for purpose-driven women.
Unlimited potential, limitless possibilities. Closing my eyes, I repeat the mantra to myself and imagine roots shooting out from the bottoms of my feet, growing to the floor, to the foundation, and into the earth. They stretch and grow deeper and deeper, branching out in different directions, anchoring me to this life-giving planet. Life force is shared with me, flowing through every cell and filling me with love, trust, and confidence. Every experience, every life lesson, it's all been leading me here. Unlimited potential, limitless possibilities. No one gave me permission to do this work. No one even told me this is what I should do. The calling, my calling, comes from within, and I feel more certainly than I ever did in college or the career that followed. I open the screen and hit the button to go live in my Facebook group. Several women quickly join, commenting that they're here and excited for the program. I take a deep breath and lead the others through calming, centering breaths of their own before I officially begin. Running through a quick introduction of myself, I recall moments of time in my life when I didn't implicitly trust my intuition or care enough about myself to be an active participant in my life. Instead, I allowed the expectations of my parents and society to direct me. I let things simply happen as they did, carried along by the current of shoulds and should nots. I didn't dream. I didn't set goals. I really just forgot how to care about myself and instead focused on pleasing all those around me, so much so that I lost the person I'd once been. The women listening to the live relate. It's an accepted typical theme for women living in the 21st century. We're still waking up to our own power and potential after centuries of suppression. And I've taken it upon myself to become a part of this movement, a movement that guides this generation of women through self-healing and personal discovery to activate their passions and purpose, because I believe with every fiber of my being that through the collective liberation of all people, our planet and our societies can be healed. And it starts on the individual level. It starts with returning women back to themselves and teaching them to love, trust, and accept themselves exactly as they are. For more than 20 years, I tried hating my own body into submission. Through direct and indirect messages, society teaches females that to be accepted, they must look, talk, and act a certain way. I realized early on that I could deny my instincts and impulses and fit into a mold rather easily, but it was the physical appearance that didn't change quite as readily as the rest. As a girl in grade school, I'd been told that my nose was too large, my hips were too wide, my legs too skinny, and the pooch on my belly meant that I'd always be fat. I spent more time attempting to blend in and go unnoticed than I did enjoying my childhood. Looking back, I wish that I could tell that small version of myself just how incredible and beautiful she really is. The proposition that women can turn off the negative self-talk and tune into a frequency of love is a novel idea for so many. I fondly remember the first time I put on a bikini and walked out into the world, 10 years, 3 kids, and 50 pounds heavier than the last time I'd worn a two-piece. Incredibly, I felt more beautiful and more confident than I ever had as a skinny teenager. I played in the water with my children, laughed at my husband's antics, and even asked him to snap a picture of me before we left. I ditched the shame and guilt and frustration toward my body and enjoyed the day. And the best part of that memory is knowing that if that level of freedom and joy is available to me, it's also possible for other women. The women watching my live are ready for this in their own lives. They too have noticed how easy it is to push their own wants and needs to the back burner again and again. They've lost sight of their passions and forgotten how to dream and desire a life they love waking up to. I have the immense honor of helping these women reclaim their lives as their own. They will become their own heroes rather than waiting for someone else to rescue them. These women will learn how to seek guidance and validation from themselves rather than others. These women will recall what it means to be the wise, wild women of their ancestry. I didn't come by this work by accident, though it certainly wasn't on purpose either. Instead, my journey through my own self-healing and personal discovery began with an attempt to unblock my creativity and my own writing. Through chance, divine guidance, or destiny, I happened upon a book that encouraged me to look beyond my procrastination and self-imposed perfectionism to the underlying beliefs that fueled my subconscious and conscious actions. When I took a deeper look at what those beliefs were, I was surprised at how thoroughly I had essentially abandoned myself. Through procrastination, and other self-defeating patterns like overwhelm, I kept myself from taking risks or truly going after anything that I wanted. But it didn't end there. I didn't trust myself to make decisions without asking others what they thought. I didn't allow myself to be impressed with something I'd done unless others were impressed too. I didn't care enough about myself to make my emotional or my physical health priorities in my life. Deep down, I believed that I was broken or flawed in some fundamental way that meant I was unworthy of a life I loved. The sad truth is that I'm not the only woman who has felt this way, though I certainly believed I was at the time. Now, through my work and my conversations with other women, I know this is a fundamental problem in our society that must be addressed. For too long, women have felt less than, unworthy, and flawed. Thankfully, the time for change is now, and women across the globe are awakening to their divine feminine power and harnessing their strength to enact real transformation for those in their own communities and across the world.
Thank you, Jessica. Next, we have Patricia Correll, who will be reading a standalone flash fiction piece called Faithful. Patricia lives in Tuscaloosa with her family. She has been writing since she learned the alphabet. She writes mostly fantasy, with occasional forays into horror. You can find her on Goodreads, Twitter, or Facebook, or check out her author page on Amazon.
The dog did not know he was famous, but he knew people stopped to look at him, and once a photographer came and took his picture for a newspaper. He whistled and called and tried to get the dog to sit up, but the wooden boards where the dog lay were warm, and the summer drone of cicadas hypnotic. The photograph in the newspaper showed the dog lying on his belly in his customary place beneath the map showing the train lines, head on his paws and his eyes half open. Once the school children who streamed through the station had slipped him treats saved from their lunch, until the station master noted how fat the dog was getting and forbade them feeding him. The dog was sorry to lose the mouthfuls of rice and sticky noodles, but he still came twice a day. It was not the children he came for, or their food. As long as he could remember, the man had risen before dawn. The dog waited, sniffing the bitter scent of coffee, until the man took his hat from the peg by the door. Then he escorted the man to the train station. As they walked, he told the dog what he planned to do in the city that day. The dog didn't understand, but he loved the man's voice, deep and warm, the words precise. When he said the dog's name, the dog tilted his head, and the man smiled at him. When the train had vanished into the morning mist, the dog went home, where he spent the day with the woman. The woman fed and petted him, but she had come to live at the house after the dog had, and he couldn't love her as he did the man. In the evening, the dog trotted back to the station. If it was raining, the woman tucked a poncho, folded into a neat square, under the dog's collar. This was the way of things. Then the man changed. Someone came to the door one morning, and the dog followed the woman as she answered it. He didn't understand the man who stood on the stoop, but his urgent tone made the dog's hackles rise. A moment later, the woman rushed out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Puzzled, he watched her go. Then the dog slept in the kitchen until it was time to go to the station. The train creaked to a stop and disgorged its passengers, among them the man. For the first time, the dog hesitated. The man didn't smell right, didn't smell of acrid cigarettes or sweet hair pomade. But then the man smiled at him, face collapsing into the familiar mass of wrinkles, and the dog ran to him. After that, the woman no longer spoke to the man, though she sometimes talked to the dog. For a while, many people came in and out of the house, but none of them noticed the man. At first, the woman cried when the dog scratched at the door in the morning and evening. The dog pressed his belly to the floor, but he persisted. He couldn't see why she didn't want him to meet his master as he always had. Finally, she gave in and opened the door for him twice a day. The dog grew used to the man whose reaching hands didn't touch, whose moving lips made no sound, and who smelled of nothing. He didn't know time was passing, the years rolling on like the trains on their tracks. He knew his ears and nose grew dull, that a white fog began to creep into the edges of his vision. His legs stiffened, and he had to leave earlier and earlier to meet the train. The ticket sellers and conductors, and even the station master, went away and were replaced. The schoolchildren grew taller and taller until they too vanished. The stiff hairs on the dog's muzzle turned white, first around his nose, then to his eyes. The woman too began to move slowly, and silver threaded her black hair. Only the man remained the same. The dog observed this, but the woman did not, for she never spoke to the man or looked at him, even when he sat across from her at the table. One evening, the dog limped to the station as usual. He had spent most of the day sleeping in a sunny patch in the garden, twitching his ears at birds, but too sore to chase them. It took him a long time to get there, but the train was late. A conductor stopped to rub his ears. The dog wagged his tail. Then he lay down beneath the map. He was very tired. The dog closed his eyes for a moment. The train came with a whoosh and a wave of oil stink. The dog yawned and trotted toward the platform. The man stepped off, walking slowly, letting the crowd stream away around him. He came to the dog, who wagged his tail. The man bent and stroked his head. The dog started and stared in wonder. The man's hand was heavy and gentle, his blunt nail scratching the dog's ears in a way he hadn't felt for years. The man smiled at him, and the dog realized that the white fog had disappeared from his vision. The smells of smoke and pomade filled his nose. "It's good to see you, my friend." The man gave him one last scratch, then straightened and hefted his briefcase. "Shall we go?" As they left the platform, the dog saw a knot of people gathered around the station map. The station master knelt on the floor, waving back the spectators. A woman was crying. The man glanced at the group, looked at the dog, and smiled. The dog strode next to him on legs that no longer ached. Together they slipped out the exit and stepped into the sunset light, and they turned toward home.
Thank you, Patricia. That was Patricia Correll, by the way. Next, we have Jason Head. He will be reading a selection from his novel, The Cranford Brothers. Jason is a computer program living in Pelham. He is a man of many moods and interests. He enjoys classical films, the writings of Pat Conroy, among others, voiceover narration, snow skiing in the Rockies, and photography. His home is decorated with his portraits of landscapes and cityscapes.
Thank you, Melanie. Let me tell you a story. My name is Robert Jackson Hood. I was named for two Civil War generals, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, though no one ever knew it when I went through grade school as Rob. I grew up on Sand Mountain in a little town called Albertville, Alabama. There wasn't much there when I was a kid, poultry farmers and used car lots. You raised chickens or you sold cars, new or many different shades of used. There were other jobs, but very few glamorous ones. If you worked at a bank, you were considered high society. When women would frequently set up one room in their house as a beauty shop and develop a loyal clientele of customers. One such woman lived up the street from us, although she had her own shop in her backyard. There were a couple of lawyers in town, clothing store owners, and two drugstores. There was one hardware store that sold everything from needles to plows, and a movie house that was referred to in our home as the picture show. Albertville was a dry town in a dry county, so if you had to go to Etowah County for beer and hard liquor. I don't recall sipping a glass of wine until after I graduated from the University of Alabama. But if you lived in Albertville, you either had a little bit of money or you had none at all. You either had a little bit of luck or you were totally devoid of it. My family was totally devoid of it, luck and money as well. The first Hood came to Albertville during Reconstruction. He came from Conyers, Georgia, just east of Atlanta. In the late 1960s, Georgia Tech fielded a defensive back from Conyers named Tony Hood, and we always wondered if perhaps he wasn't related to us somehow. When I lived in Atlanta one winter in the mid-1980s, I went into a realtor's office in Conyers named Reggie Hood. I told him who I was and timidly asked him if perhaps we weren't related to each other somewhere down the line. I was told the first Hood to come to Georgia came from North Carolina and that he had 18 sons. Their descendants are spread all over the South, if not the entire country today. My great-great-grandfather, Harmon Hood, was like most of that post-war era, outrunning carpetbaggers, Sherman, and whatever semblance of the law remained during that time. He acquired a piece of land on Sand Mountain, rounded up a couple of mules, a woman willing to become his wife, and began plowing as he had done in Georgia. Not much is known about him after that. He died as quietly as he lived, in his sleep in 1891. His son Oscar is where my story really begins. The only vestige of Oscar Hood that remains on this earth is a faded black and white photograph that my father's brother gave me. It shows a broken down old man sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch of an ancient wooden house he evidently lived in during his last years. The portion of the house in the photograph is unpainted. Oscar's gnarled hands are folded in his lap, left and right. He is clad in overalls and high-top shoes that were worn out. He does not appear to be wearing socks. Gray-headed and unsmiling, his face shows every inch of the miles he plowed in his youth behind a mule. Atop his head is a ragged slouch hat faded from the sun. One suspects that he barely had enough energy to rise out of that chair. In his youth, Oscar had something of a mind for business, at least agricultural prosperity anyway. It is assumed in the litany of my family's history that he acquired his acumen from the long hours he spent guiding a plow behind those mules Harmon hitched him to every spring and summer when a new crop was planted. Such burdensome labor would sooner or later lead almost any enterprising fellow to think of a better way to make money. He knew that the secret to making a man's fortune in an agrarian society was land, and plenty of it. Each time he planted and made any profit at all, he set about to buy more land. He took the 20 acres Harmon had bequeathed him and over the years parlayed it into 300. The Hoods were cotton farmers, as were almost anyone else on Sand Mountain who made their living from the soil. Cotton had been king for 300 years in the South and would be for another 300 unless another war erupted, so it was thought. Each autumn, kids got new shoes, bank accounts were replenished, and if you were extremely profitable, your house acquired some modernity that made you the talk of the town. Usually, that was indoor plumbing. A family's wealth was measured in part by whether or not there was an outhouse behind the home they lived in. My father didn't see a porcelain toilet anywhere but school until he was 18 years old. Oscar knew that land needed hands to tend it. His wife, Maud Coates, became quite prolific at bearing those hands. In all, she delivered 10 hungry, bawling Hoods, the 6th being my grandfather Jim, the last killing her before it too perished from the singular act of being delivered out of a worn-out 40-year-old body in 1930. The dead child was born on a blistering August day, almost at high noon between 2 rows of cotton. The little boy was laid to rest that afternoon in an unmarked grave, and his mother 2 days later. At some point in time shortly thereafter, Oscar took in a boarder, one of the thousands of displaced Depression-era hobos who roamed the countryside picking up whatever odd job he could find in any small town that would not run him off for vagrancy. Taking in that boarder was the single biggest mistake Oscar made in his entire life. Had his wife not died, it would never have happened. His name was Coltrane Winters. My great-grandfather thought he would pick up the slack in the field left by the death of his wife. When I was a child, my father's family was quite fond of comparing Winters with anyone who they considered shiftless, lazy, mean, womanizing, or merely drunk. Such persons were said to be as sorry as Coltrane Winters. I remember asking my father once as a bold 7-year-old at the supper table, immediately after he had applied the phrase to his boss, "Just how sorry is Coltrane Winters, Dad?" For my trouble, I got a look that would melt steel, the back of his hand across my face, and a shut-up meat muttered between bites of cornbread and peas. My mother would later tell me that Coltrane Winters had been responsible for the one incident that kept my family poor for 2 generations. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Jason Head reading a piece from the Cranford brothers. Next up, we have Charles Smith. He will be reading selections from his nonfiction book, The Alabama Connection. The Alabama Connection is a nonfiction book that he's currently finishing up. It is about how the state of Alabama has a connection to just about every major news story in the last 2 centuries. Charles was born in 1943 in Grenada, Mississippi. He has lived in all the Deep South states, including Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, and finally Alabama. He graduated from Robert E. Lee High School in Montgomery in 1961 and from Auburn University in 1965, where he majored in commercial art and advertising. He participated in baseball, football, and track and field and was a 2-time state champion pole vaulter and a 2-year track and field letterman at Auburn University. These days, Charles is a retired advertising executive that lives in Birmingham, Alabama. In addition to the Alabama Connection, he has written 5 detective mystery romance fiction books under the pen name C. Smith.
I'm going to be reading the foreword to the book I've been working on for a long time, The Alabama Connection, that I hope to get published in next spring. And I've labeled or headed up the foreword as "It's a Phenomenon." A note from the author. In October of 2002, I was tuned in, as usual, to Fox News. I was following the DC sniper case as it unfolded on national TV. As I gathered this news in, I came to the realization that I am definitely a news junkie. I've always had a compulsive need to keep up with the news. A few times I've failed to stay tuned in to find out later that I had missed a major news story. More recent, I let my guard down and I didn't monitor the news for a while, only to find out that we had found Osama bin Laden, killed him, and buried him at sea. So I had some catching up to do. Time after time, as the news stories developed, I would hear that familiar word, Alabama. I became acutely aware of this, and I was amazed at how many times I would hear the connection. When I talk about major news stories, I mean front page, big headline stories, events that books have been written about and movies and documentaries produced for. On that particular day, as I followed up on the DC sniper case, also known as the Beltway attacks, something leaped out to me. For weeks, these killers had been on a rampage terrorizing Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. Then the news commentator said it. He said there was a connection to Alabama. I said to myself, wait, have I not heard this before? Over and over, just about every major news story that I followed had the same thing in common, the Alabama connection. For a long time, I resigned myself to the fact that I would probably be the only one to ever notice these things. However, I did mention it to my friends sometimes in conversations. A while back, I was on a tour of Cape Canaveral, and something the bus driver tour guide said inspired me. As he rode out to view the space shuttle launch site, he said, "You see the gravel road that the shuttle uses to reach the launch pad? That's Tennessee River rock from the state of Alabama." When he said that, something clicked, and I knew that I was going to have to compile all of this information and document it to let everyone know what I had discovered. The biggest fear that I have as I release this book for publication is that the next day something big will break and I won't be able to include it in the book. For that reason, I appeal to the reader to be alert, and when that next big story breaks, just look for the Alabama connection. I promise it will be there. Some of these connections you may consider minuscule, and if there just wasn't so many of these, I wouldn't mention them. Of course, some of the stories are covered up with the connection. Most of these news stories you will be familiar with, but I hope by reviewing them, you will learn something you didn't know. I've tried to just hit the highlights of each story to give you a feel for how important they are. With some of them, you will tell yourself, "Oh, I knew about that connection." Many others you will say, I didn't know that." I invite you to follow me through the maze of each of these high-profile news stories to seek out the Alabama connection. Some of these connections will be evident from the very beginning of the story, and some won't be as easily detected. But all of the news stories are major in scope. Originally, I had decided that I would not write this book unless I could find an Alabama connection to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So I spent 3 weeks researching that fateful day. I found it's unbelievable how many conspiracy theories surround the assassination. Then finally one day I stumbled onto a significant connection to Alabama. You have to admit that that news story ranks up there with the biggest of all time. That was the day that I decided that I would begin to do the necessary research to compile all the connections to see if there were enough to warrant writing a book. Then 2 days later, I discovered that the Charles Manson murders in California had more than one Alabama connection. That was all it took. I knew then that I would write the book and I would name it The Alabama Connection. Usually when a book is written about a specific state such as this one, your first thought is that it could be done for just about every state. In this case, I honestly do not think it could be done for another single state. Since this book is not meant to be a historical document, a lot of facts may be skipped over as I point out the Alabama connection. As I compile these connections, I began to develop a creed, a motto, or a slogan, whatever you may call it. Nothing reaches the newsstand, the magazine cover, or is launched out over the airways without first passing through Alabama. The Alabama connection is a phenomenon. It's like Alabama has some kind of a vortex that has an uncanny magnetic attraction for major news stories, an amazing anomaly akin to the Bermuda Triangle. I hope you will appreciate this book and find it to be enlightening. You will notice that I included as many photographs as possible, for I feel that photos are our windows to our past. And I think it's important to show what the men and women that shaped our history looked like. This book is a challenge to any reader, writer, government official, or news person to find another state that has half as many major news story connections. And then the next page after that forward is kind of addendum to the forward. It's a short little, I've got headed up, one day. One day on a date unknown to man, something will happen. No one knows where or how or what. All we know is something will happen, and one day all this will be revealed to us. But for now, we can only assume that this mysterious happening will take place. Scholars will be amazed. Authors will be inspired to write books about it. Movies will be made about it. People will come from miles away to see where it happened. The news media will analyze it from all perspectives. In spite of all the mystery, there's one thing we know for sure. It will either happen in Alabama or it will be achieved by an Alabamian. Or if it's newsworthy, it will have to have the Alabama connection. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That was Charles Smith reading The Alabama Connection. Next up, we have Schuyler Randall. Schuyler will be reading a selection from his upcoming novel, The Good Doctors. Schuyler Randall is a self-published author specializing in adult mysteries and thrillers. His first novel, a mystery thriller titled Jacqueline Willoughby, was published in 2017, followed in 2019 by the prequel titled Raina. Schuyler now resides in McCalla, Alabama with his wife Yvette and their West Highland Terrier Q. Today, Schuyler will be reading an excerpt from his newest manuscript, The Good Doctors. Robert Madigan, a promising University of Pennsylvania medical student, feels forced to leave school to care for his family after his father's untimely passing. As he prepares for departure, his professor connects him to a man who offers him a lucrative alternative: become a paid-for-hire killer.
Philadelphia, 1937, the introduction of Clark Magnuson. The Edward T. Moon Building honored its namesake, an 1879 Penn graduate and retired head of the university's physiology department. His key role in enabling Edward Muybridge's groundbreaking study of human and animal locomotion brought the world's attention to the school and cemented its place in the scientific community in the early years of the 20th century. The state-of-the-art building was teeming with students, physicians, and understudies from around the country and the world, eagerly observing the innovative work of some of the most skilled surgeons, forging scientific history every day. When David Hayes Agnew was demonstrating his new procedure, his operating theater was standing room only. His work would invariably become standard procedure. Clark Magnuson thrived in the presence of such eminent intellectuals. Surrounding himself with notable biologists and physicians reinforced his belief, his certainty, really, that he belonged with them. As he excelled in his medical studies, he excelled in his sporting activities as well. He rode for Penn and played football for the school. Though he had the instant prestige of the Magnuson name, he had earned prestige in his own right as an extraordinary student athlete. His status had earned him residence in the nearby Moon Building, a lush residence hall named for the same scientist and honoring him with equal grandeur. Robert found the contrast with his own drab residence positively amusing. Though the building was quite small, it was at the same time imposing, gleaming in polished white marble that stood out amongst the otherwise indistinct brownstone buildings in the dormitory quad. Robert suspected that for the residents who lived there, simply approaching the building reinforced their sense of entitlement and exceptionalism. He knew it did for Clark. He told him so. Still, the hinges on the oaken doors at the top of the steps creaked on their brass hinges, belying a lack of maintenance that likely grated those who expected a certain standard of quality. Robert had no trouble remembering Clark's flat number, 35. Like everything else in Clark's life, this too had a story behind it. He had told Robert and Samuel on almost every visit to his flat that 35 had been his favorite number since childhood, and a certain sign that he should remain at Penn to complete his psychology doctorate. He was consistently receiving lucrative offers from other universities. He could have easily transferred to Harvard or Princeton. He often told them, but 35 was a definitive indication that he belonged at Penn. Robert wondered about Clark's endless signs. Did he believe there was a special God of the very wealthy? Sometimes Clark's perception of the world seemed absolutely mystifying. Robert paused a moment, took a deep breath, and knocked on the heavy wooden door to Clark's flat. This would invariably be a very interesting discussion. Clark, are you there? He knocked again. Finally, he heard footsteps and a muffled cry through the mahogany. Come on in then. Robert pushed open the door, but the room was almost completely dark. He'd been here during the day and admired the first-class accoutrements, but now he could see nothing of Clark's penthouse suite-like student accommodations. Suddenly, a light switched on and Clark, like magic, was standing before him. He stuck his hand out. "Bobby, my good man." Robert shook his hand. He hated such nicknames and only accepted this one from Clark. Since he'd come to Penn, he'd come to discover that the rich love to call everyone by diminutive names. Immediately, Clark crossed the room to his desk, sat down, rested his feet, clad in black leather boots on the desktop. He clasped his hands behind his head and rested with his eyes staring up at the ceiling. Robert waited a moment, then finally asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm visualizing our win in this week's football game," Clark replied, then looked directly at Robert, as if realizing he was there for the first time. "What are you doing?" Robert sat on the edge of the desk closer to Clark. He gazed at the trophy case behind him, filled with certificates, medals, trophies, highlighting an already illustrious life, then looked right into Clark's eyes. "Do you believe a man can see into another man's soul?" "That's an odd question. Do you?" Clark thought for a moment. "The eyes are a window to the soul, they say." "Yes, I would say so. Why?" When Robert hesitated, Clark crossed his arm, signaling his suspicion. "What's going on?" He put his legs down on the floor and placed them under his desk. He leaned forward, ready to hear what Robert had to say. Robert, however, wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. "Clark, I have a question for you." Clark shrugged. "Look into my eyes." "I am. What's this all about?" "Do you think I could kill someone?" Clark had to laugh out loud. "What?" "I'm serious." Robert leaned forward so that Clark could see his eyes clearly. "Do you think I could kill someone?" "That's a bizarre question, yet a serious one. I'm asking you as a friend, do you think I can kill someone?" Clark gazed into his friend's eyes. "Is this a practical joke?" "Tell me what you think." Their eyes locked, almost for a full minute. Finally, Clark blinked and sat back in his chair. "I think so, given the right circumstances." Robert nodded solemnly, and Clark realized this wasn't a joke. "What is this all about?" "I think a lot of people can kill. Why on earth are you asking?" "What have you done?" "Not a thing," Robert assured him. "Not yet." "Not yet. Can we speak confidentially?" "Of course. I've received," Robert paused to consider the right words, "a business proposition." "It must be some business," Clark speculated. Robert nodded. "You recall Professor Howell?" Clark's eyes widened. "Yes. Are you going to kill him?" "Clever guess, but no. He and his colleagues have made me an offer." "I'm listening." "A very lucrative offer." "Get to the point, Robert." Robert had carefully considered the wording. Clark, after all, was from an entirely separate world than he or Samuel. Drawing a parallel to law enforcement wasn't necessary in this case. "I have been asked to facilitate the termination of disagreeable elements disturbing men of means." Clark looked at him long and hard. If anyone had heard the conversation, they wouldn't have any idea of Robert's meaning. But being a man of means, Clark understood. "And you're telling me this because I'd appreciate your help." Clark nodded his head. "Professor Howell is behind this?" Robert nodded. They paused for almost a full minute. "Does it intrigue you?" Robert asked. Clark thought about it for a moment and admitted, "Yes." "Why are you asking, though?" "I need your brains, Clark." Robert paused to let that sink in. And I need some of your brawn." "To kill?" "To prepare." "Prepare?" "The patient." "Patient? Too kind word. Perhaps for ruthless, immoral men. I want you to show them the error of their ways." Clark grinned in fascination. "What are you talking about? With the proper weapon, the act can be quick and clean. I want you to show these men the reason for their punishments." "Before you kill them?" "Exactly. I thought you would enjoy the opportunity to explore the criminal mind, to manipulate it, wear it down," and Clark finished the sentence, "and assure a sense of horror and utter regret at the moment of termination." Robert smiled at his friend. "You're a poet." "I am when I'm inspired." So you're in? Clark didn't hesitate, extending his hand. I'm in. Robert shook Clark's hand heartily. Excellent. Without you, we might not have gone ahead. Robert told him. We? Samuel's with us. Samuel? Robert nodded. Clark winked at him, joking. You mean I wasn't the first? He and I have a lot to gain, Robert told him, leaving out the obvious, and a lot to lose. Clark shrugged. Samuel is a doctor and a mortician, all in one. What could be more perfect? My point exactly. He's a good man, honestly. I'm a bit surprised he'd go along with this. Robert repeated his explanation. He has a lot to gain. Clark sat back down and relaxed again, replacing his feet on the desk. So what's your plan? It's not totally worked out. That's why I need the two of you for some strategizing. Clark nodded. My forte. He looked at the calendar on his desk. Let's all meet at the lake on Saturday morning. About 7? I'll bring the bottle. We'll row out into the fog and work it out. You seem excited. Clark grinned. Who wouldn't be? Most people. Robert, my friend, how many times do I have to tell you? You and I and Samuel, we're not most people. Thank you.
Thank you, Schuyler. That was Schuyler Randall reading a portion of his novel, The Good Doctors. Next up, we have Hayley Moon. Hayley will be reading a short story called Death and the Mortician. Hayley is an Alabama native and has published 2 poems, Damaged Wings and Untitled, in her alma mater's literary magazine, The Filibuster. Hayley is an avid crocheter and a proud cat parent to Babe. She is currently working on a collection of short horror stories. And here is Hayley.
Charles steadied himself, leaning into the hand grip as he slid the body into the refrigerator for the evening. The deceased wife had left 15 minutes earlier, grief-stricken. Initially, she had been unwilling to leave the funeral home, afraid to abandon her husband of 44 years. His death had been hard for her to grasp. Charles had comforted her for over an hour, as he had so many times before, to those that used his services for their loved ones that had left the living behind, trying to come to terms with death. He stopped at the doorway and with the sigh flicked off the lights. He moved down the hall in an unhurried manner, shaking his head at the notion of coming to an understanding with death. He was 62 years old and had buried a lot of people, family, friends, and strangers. Slowly, he made his way to the front to say goodbye to the receptionist. It was past 6. Viewing hours had officially ended an hour ago. Is everyone gone for the day, Miss Ann? She rose from the desk, purse clutched underneath her arm. Yes, sir. She walked to him, smiling, and grabbed his hand. You get some rest now, and I left a plate on the counter in the kitchen. Let me walk you out. The wrinkles around her mouth deepened. You were always so malleable, even as a little boy. They walked to the front entrance, holding hands. The silence between them was comfortable. His smile was light. It was the same smile he had when he would walk with her to church on those Sunday mornings many years ago. She had been beautiful and was always so well loved. It's starting to rain. Do you want me to drive you home? She laughed. No, dear. I'm more than able to get myself from point A to point B. You know my reflexes are just as good as yours. Now, I know you don't need to be on the road if that's the case. They both laughed. Her chuckle was deep, and he became warm at the familiar sound. I'll be fine. Get some rest. She reached deep into her bag and pulled out a rain poncho. I almost forgot. A man stopped by just a little after 5. Was he looking to make arrangements? No, he said he would come back tonight. He was a strange, cold man. She had an expression on her face that he couldn't place. Are you all right, Miss Ann? She seemed to come out of her trance. Yes, I'm fine. She paused. He was a very odd man, so tall and thin. She smiled up at him. You know something? I'm going to go and call my son tonight. She patted the side of his face once again before turning and leaving him standing in the doorway. He watched her drive away. A strange feeling came over him, and he closed the door, signaling the finality of her departure. Slowly, he made his way upstairs. He set the home security system and headed into the small living room. He toed off his shoes and tossed his blazer on top of them and walked over to the small bar he had in the back of the room. He poured himself a hefty amount of brandy and gulped down its contents. The amber liquid burned, and the sensation warmed him, sending a pleasurable signal throughout his being. He poured himself another and went and eased onto the couch and grabbed the remote from the table. He reclined back, drink in hand. The tension dissipated from his shoulders as he made contact with the soft leather. Back door open. The voice echoed throughout the hall, drowning out the sounds of the sitcom. He sprang upright at the noise, confused. He didn't remember closing his eyes, and the sudden movement had caused him to knock his glass onto the floor. He looked around frantically before rushing to his bedroom. He rounded the corner of his bed and fell to his knees in front of the nightstand and fumbled around in the drawer before pulling out the .38. He stood listening for any sound. The house was silent, and he squared his shoulders and headed downstairs. He kept his back against the wall until he reached the bottom of the stairs, where he paused and listened for a second time. The only sound came from the television he forgot to turn off. Charles kept moving toward the kitchen. As he neared, he felt the temperature drop despite the Alabama heat. Slowly, he entered the kitchen to find a figure at the table. He raised his gun, ready to fire at the slightest movement of the intruder, and became chilled before the tingling sensation left, to be replaced by a sense of calmness he had never felt before. He looked at the table, he looked at the man, taking note of his chiseled jaw and the longness of his face. The man's hands were long and slender, and Charles kept looking him over and deemed him non-threatening, but he kept the gun aimed at the man's chest. "Who are you?" he asked, confused, as he looked around the room and at the back door. The man smiled. "You should know, Charles. You work with me every day." He chuckled at the puzzled expression on the undertaker's face. Charles looked at him hard and released a sound that was between a hiss and a small cry. "I don't believe it." Charles approached the table slowly and gripped the back of the chair. "Well, believe it. Now sit down." He hurriedly complied. His legs had become weak, threatening to buckle. He placed the revolver on his side with a heavy thud. The man looked from the gun to Charles, and he found Charles staring at him, his face hard. "I'm assuming you know now, Charles." He nodded. "I do. I believe I do. And then again, I don't. Am I dreaming?" He sat up straight, as if realization just dawned on him. "I'm dead, ain't I?" The man's eyebrows shot up. He was amused. "You say that as if you are certain." He smiled, making his long face appear even colder. "If you were dead, Charles, then you wouldn't need to see me. I come for the living." "So I'm still alive." He nodded. Charles gripped his chest. "Thank God." He sighed and looked around the kitchen. He paused, bringing his gaze back to the man before him. "You said you come for the living, so then it's time. Time for me to go?" "No, it's not your time. I was around and I thought I'd stop by to see how you were doing." Charles stared at him in relief and at the same time disbelief. "I know you have questions, Charles. Everyone does." The mortician rubbed his face, looking at the man. "Who are you?" "Well, I'm not necessarily a who, Charles, but I am more of a what. Now, what I am is death. But I suspect you figured that out already." He thought he was losing his mind to believe the man before him was whom he said he was, and yet something within him would not allow him to believe otherwise. The undertaker licked his lips. "Do you have a name?" "I go by many." The thin man cocked his head to the side. "You know, Charles, I have given very few the opportunity you have now. Are you sure those are the kinds of questions you want to ask?" The undertaker placed his head in his hands, eyes closed. Sometime tonight would be nice. I do have a schedule to keep. He spoke, amused. Charles nodded and again rubbed his hand down his face, taking with the swipe the beads of sweat that had collected on his forehead. Is there anyone ready to die? The man leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes as if reminiscing. Very few. He opened them and smiled, inclining his head toward Charles. Continue. Have you ever let someone that was supposed to die live? No. Never? He looked at Charles. I will add context to my short answer. Where I am sent, I must collect. Well, has anyone offered you money? Tried to bribe you? I do distinctly remember this woman. She was a plain woman, but a very wealthy one for her time. She was the wife of a nobleman, and she offered me money, her finest jewels, and garments of silk dyed the deepest of purple. The man shook his head and sneered in disgust. Her money was cursed, her pebbles were worthless, and her silks were as rags to me. Do you like doing this, bringing pain and grief to people? That is difficult to answer. I don't bring grief nor pain. They are the byproducts of what I do. Now, Charles, I have a question for you. If I told you yes, would you see me as more of a monster than you already do? Charles stared into the man's obsidian eyes, silent. A moment passed before the man spoke again. You look upset. Is there anything about this you don't like? Charles asked. The man stared at him for a moment before he leaned back and crossed his leg. Let me tell you what I don't like, Charles. You creatures run around like you're going to live forever. Let me destroy that delusion. When you were born, all of your days were determined and given to me, so that at the end of those days, I come to collect. He chuckled. You know what's funny, Charles? You humans are always screaming and singing about going to heaven, about being with God. How else do you think you're going to get there, Charles? You must give up the flesh. He sighed. I've upset you. No, you haven't. Not at all. That wasn't a question, Charles. Now continue. This is heavy. This is real heavy. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. I would imagine for a mortal like yourself it would be. Death chuckled. What else you got, Charles? You seemed amused. I always am. Everyone fears death. People fear the unknown. Life is unknown, and yet you all seem fine not knowing how it will turn out. He looked at the small wall clock and began to rise. It seems our time has come to an end. Charles was startled before he relaxed, allowing his shoulders to slump forward. Are you leaving? Yes. I said before I do have a schedule to keep. I have one last question. Death stood still and nodded. Yes? Why did you come here tonight? I came by earlier. I'm sure Anne told you. Yes, she did. I'm going to see Anne tonight. I wanted you to know, Charles. You have always loved her so much. The mortician dropped his head and began to openly weep. Don't weep, my friend, for I come to relieve the weary of their burdens and restore what life has taken away. Charles closed his eyes to steady his breathing. When he opened them, he found himself alone in the small living room, drink in hand, and only the sounds of the television filling the silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. That was Hayley Moon reading Death and the Mortician. Next up, we have Walt Henley. Walt will be reading Chapter 1 of his children's novel, The Firekeepers. Walt Henley is a geologist who knows that even stones tell stories if you are patient enough to read them. He recently made the short list in the Faulkner Wisdom Creative Writing Competition for short stories and took second place for his short stories submitted to the annual Alabama Writers Cooperative Writing Competition. When not hammering rocks, he hammers out stories on his laptop. The Firekeepers is a children's novel that grew from stories Walt used to tell his grandkids. It's full of all sorts of creatures, big and small, in a fantastical world of high adventure. If you'd like to read the rest of the story, he's telling it under the name of W.B. Chalker on his Facebook writers page. I'll drop the link to that in the chat. In the meantime, here is Walt.
All right, thank you, Melanie. Once upon a more normal time, not that long ago, before face masks and Zoom meetings, before Netflix binge watching and remote school lessons, before ventilator counts and curve flattening, when kids could still sleep over at their grandparents' house, the biggest privilege of a grandpa was to tell stories, either around a nice big campfire or after the kids had been safely tucked in bed. For my grandkids, the scarier the story, the better. Who's Got My Golden Arm is a classic, especially wailed on a cold winter night around a backyard fire while a marshmallow drips from a stick and threatens to burst into flames, and Uncle Jason sneaks up behind an unsuspecting child, ready to pounce out of the dark at just the right time. Stories are like fires of the heart that warm us from the inside and light the imagination. They speak of places that never were but should be, creatures that couldn't possibly but still do, and incredible adventures that happen right before our eyes. They are great, entertaining lies that somehow speak the truth of who we are or who we could be and how we're all connected. Those who tell the stories and those who keep them in their hearts, they are the real firekeepers. So join me for a few minutes. Close your eyes, try not to fall asleep, and open your imagination. This is the beginning of the story. Part 1, From the Heart, Chapter 1, The Tale of the Serpent. The nights were the hardest times, nothing to keep her thoughts occupied except watching, waiting, remembering. She hated the waiting, so she remembered. She missed the jungle. She missed her gibbon tribe. She missed the hot, languid days gathering fruits by the river with her sister, and the late evening watches with her father, learning to track the movements of the ground creatures by their grunts and grumbles and growls and calls, and the raucous, freewheeling flights through the branches with her friends. She missed it all with a deep-in-the-bones ache born of regret she could not relieve. The vicious, biting cold snapped her back to the present. Blaze pulled her knees close to her chest and tucked her face behind folded arms, leaving only her eyes exposed. She shivered, her thick fur a poor shield from the icy fingers that clawed at her. Moonlight danced on every crystal blanketing the tundra ahead of them, but it refused to pierce the dark alpine forest they were leaving behind. A cascade of falling stars streaked and faded in the sky. Her eyes drilled into the gloom, fixating on every imagined movement, trying but failing to assure herself they were still alone. Blaze was on watch. She was always on watch. From her perch on a twisted pine at the edge of the timberline near the top of the world, she continually scanned the darkness, searching for what she knew was following them. In her mind, she retraced the tortuous journey from Gibbon Wood, a place once so full of life and family. Now she had only her sister Grace. Gazing down the stretch of ever-climbing mountains, she remembered the stories told by her father, stories he had heard from his mother and father, stories passed down from the elders before them, on and back until time began. Stories of the beginning of the world, when the great serpent climbed down from the sky and decided to make its home in the warm waters below. Slowly, over seasons too many to count, it turned to earth and stone. All manner of creatures, great and small, some with roots and some with legs and some with wings, made their homes upon its back. As long as the serpent rested, they thrived. Most of her life, Blaze had thrived along with him. But tonight, she was afraid. An insignificant thistle caught on the serpent's scales. The forest shadows below her rose and fell in the beast's undisturbed slumber, and to stoke her courage, she retold the stories in her mind. They told of the place somewhere beyond the darkness, far beyond the horizon, where the serpent rested its head at the edge of the churning sea and quenched its thirst. They said its hot breath still steamed from the boiling cauldrons and geysers that bounded the great water where the sun took its refuge every day. Just inland from the ring of fire, the creature's heart beat in the thick jungle forest, the bosom where life had been cradled for countless millennia. The jungle was where Blaze's own heart remained. It was her home, the home she desperately longed for but knew she might never see again. She had traveled so far, fleeing across the back of the beast, always climbing, always looking behind her, until now she found herself in these frigid mountains where the serpent arched its armored spine and its tail touched the sky, as if being born of nothingness or being swallowed by it. The stories did not help, and she drove the thought from her mind. In the stillness, the cold air carried sound like an empty cavern. The odd gibberish of the human girl talking to the fire below reached into Blaze's consciousness and broke her reverie, if only for a while. Blaze comprehended the girl well enough when she communicated in the way of animals, but struggled to understand the lilting sing-song, grunts, clicks, and wails that were the language of humans. Only a few of the words made sense to her. But she recognized grief in any language, and her own emotions bubbled inside her. The girl rocked from side to side and peered into the fire as if searching for something recognizable in the flames. A burning log crackled and whispered a low hiss. She set her jaw and spoke again, determined to get it off her chest. The girl's words rushed out in a torrent, and Blaze realized she was speaking to her mother. She was afraid. She was sorrowed. She was angry. The heavy end of a branch suddenly snapped and crashed into the fire, scattering frightened cinders into the cold. The girl scrambled backwards, startled, but her wide eyes hardened into defiance. Even Blaze flinched. She did not trust this human, and she certainly did not trust any fire. The human child pulled her wolf skin closer and resumed her place by the angry flames. Blaze's companions did not share her mistrust. The dinosaur lying beside the girl tilted his heavy head to catch the words. Peter, the young taro, long Blaze's friend, stopped circling in the pale lit sky and settled at the edge of the firelight. Blaze's sister, Grace, leaned in with her wide gibbon eyes. One of the girl's words pierced into Blaze's recognition, while the human creature spread her arms as if introducing her companions to the fire. Family. In her watchtower, Blaze shook her head and stared down at the child. Such a strange creature, she thought. So weak, so fragile, so dangerous. This human is not my family. Fiercely resolute, Blaze returned to her vigil and scoured the night for the coming danger. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt. That was Walt Henley reading The Firekeepers, Chapter 1. Next up, we have Nancy Dorman Hickson. Nancy will be reading a selection from what she hopes will become a memoir. The selection is called What Remains. Nancy is originally from Mississippi but has lived in Birmingham since the early 1990s. She was a features editor with Progressive Farmer and Southern Living magazines for many years and now freelances as a writer for magazine, web, and public relations clients. She is the co-author of Diplomacy and Diamonds, the memoir of Joanne King Herring, the Texas woman who was portrayed by Julia Roberts in the Tom Hanks movie Charlie Wilson's War.
Thank you. What remains? When I attend the funeral for my Uncle Bob, I ask my cousin Charlotte about our grandmother's pregnancy. Daddy told me Mama was a twin, I tell her. I've been pregnant with twins myself when my dad dropped this twin bombshell about my deceased mother. I didn't think to ask him if Mama's twin was stillborn or miscarried. Cousin Charlotte responded, I never heard that. My dad did tell me that there were 2 boys who were stillborn after he and your mama were born. He said he remembered going with Granddaddy to bury one of the infants. Can you imagine? I said, oh, Daddy, did it scar you? I can't believe he took you along to bury a baby. He told me it was different in those days. There were dead babies all the time then. I think about my uncle's phrasing, dead babies all the time. If dead babies were common, a toddler observing the burial of his deceased sibling wouldn't have been a big deal, I suppose. Still, it seemed like a big deal to me. I can't help playing out that scene in my head, picturing my grandfather as a young man burying his child. In the image I've conjured, my Uncle Bob is a child sitting in the passenger side of the car. Stay here, Bob, the father tells his toddler. Bob is only 2 years old, but I'm sure he does what his daddy's firm voice asks of him. This man's command is always obeyed by everyone he encounters, even though he never raises his voice. As the tall, lean father opens the trunk to remove a shovel, perhaps the toddler swivels around to watch. Bob's eyes follow his daddy as he walks across the spongy grass, carrying the shovel to a clear, grassy spot. He lifts clods of earth, creating a small mound of Mississippi red clay dirt beside the hole he is creating. Bob is barely old enough to walk, so when his father, my grandfather, returns, he scoops up the child in his arms. In my mind, I see the father curling the toddler into his side, resting him on his hip bone and using one strong arm to support the child as he opens the back door of the car. I picture a baby quilt with images of fluffy lambs resting there. Cradled inside is the quilt-cocooned, too small body of the son who never drew breath. Miles away, I imagine the birth room where his wife, my grandmother, is bloody and perspiring from the effort of trying to bring a new soul into the world. I think of family friend and physician Dr. Fetty murmuring the hard truth to the exhausted mother, that the baby has died, a reality she surely knows the moment her body quits heaving and pushing to be met only with deathly silence. I imagine her heart crumbling as she faces the fact that a child she expected to feed and clothe and love and dream a future into being has vanished, swallowed up into nothing but a bit of inanimate flesh whose sole purpose will be to be buried. I think about the daddy gently lifting the tiny swaddled bundle from the back seat, the weight of its unformed body so small it must feel like holding air. With the burden of a dead child in one arm and the heft of a lively child in the other, I envision the father taking careful, measured steps to the ground he has prepared. In the scene playing out in my mind, he sets Bob on the ground and says quietly, "Don't run off." Perhaps the father pauses with the lifeless child in his arms. For just a moment, maybe, he allows himself to rock the child and grieve over the life of a son that will never be. And maybe he uncovers the boy's face, marveling at his small, perfect features. Gently, I imagine, he reluctantly covers the precious face with a quilt, perhaps tightly tucking the blanket around the tiny being, just like he tucked Bob and would have tucked this child into bed after goodnight kisses. I think of him laying the body down into the good earth, the weight no more than a handful of angel's feathers. Out of the corner of his eye, perhaps the father sees Bob growing antsy and realizes he should hurry. He needs to get back to his wife. He is the one who teases her out of fears and bolsters her wavering confidence and strengthens her when she is weak and weary, as she surely is on this day. I don't have to imagine this. I have seen the love between my grandparents, but I won't witness that relationship for many years to come. On this day, I picture him as a young man settling the dirt that will cover his infant son, first with a shovel, then on his knees, smoothing the plot with his hands, finally patting the burial spot tenderly, as if it is the top of a child's head. Perhaps Bob mimics him, playing patty-cake, baker's man, on top of the ground where his baby brother rests. It's not a stretch to imagine my grandfather, a religious man, next turning to his faith to consecrate the moment. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he would have said. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." I hear and see it as clearly as if I were there, the young father nodding his head, satisfied. It is done. I imagine him kneeling to Bob's level, opening his arms wide. I see the toddler launching himself into his father's waiting arms, safe and secure, protected from all that can go wrong forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was Nancy Dorman Hickson reading What Remains. Next up, we have Donna Thomas reading a short story called Chocolate. Donna G. Thomas is a native of Birmingham, Alabama. She has a bachelor's and master's degrees in creative writing from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She writes across all genres, children's books, young adult, and adult novels. She enjoys letting her imagination run rampant. Her stories have been published in PMS Magazine, the Birmingham News, and the Steel Toe Review.
Thank you. The story is Chocolate. The chocolate is melting, I know, but sometimes it's better that way, Bobby replies. Things can change and still be sweet and good. She pulls Jamie's hand into hers. You should try it. Jamie rolls her muffled brown eyes at Bobby and snatches her hand away. You never give up. The girls sit in silence for a few minutes. They watch the waves of the Pacific Ocean come ashore and taste the grains of grimy sand. Jamie, her knees pulled tight to her chest and her oval face covered in Louis Vuitton sunglasses. And Bobby, her long athletic legs stretched to full length and her lucid face exposed to the sun, are both frustrated with expectation and reality. Are you going to church tomorrow, Bobby asked. Yes, as always. Are you going to pray for the priest to forgive you? Yes, as always. So you want forgiveness for being who God made you to be. This is not me. I am the cheerleader, the beauty queen. This is not me. Then why are you here? I don't know. A tear rolls down from under Jamie's sunglasses, travels to the edge of her jaw, and drops softly into the valley of her breast. Bobby grabs her hand again. I won't leave you, I promise. We will go through this together. Silence creeps into the conversation again. The stillness is a strange conversationalist. It speaks of things you want to push aside. It makes you feel things you want to numb. My family won't accept this. They love you, Bobby says. She pushes Jamie's sunburnt curl away from her face. They won't abandon you, trust me. Bobby sees that she isn't getting through to the girl she's loved since Mrs. Johnston's K-5 class at Whispering Oaks Elementary School. So she tries to diffuse the situation. Hey, remember that time your dad almost caught us in the garage? Yeah, but you were always thinking ahead. You pulled out that Playgirl magazine. Your dad swore we were hot teenage girls with nothing but big, brawny, bad boys on our mind. Yeah, he and Mom had a field day with that one. They tried perilously to explain the sex rules to me. Jamie deepens her voice like that of an old bluesy guitar to imitate her father. Listen, Jamie, you're a young girl now and things are happening to your body. The girl's boisterous laugh filled the area before Jamie could finish her parroting. And your mom, Bobby says through her laughter. Oh yeah, Mom. Her petite 5'4" frame looks so submissive next to Dad. She is so sweet, Bobby adds. Yes, she is sweet. And she is not submissive. I've seen her stand up to your 6-foot-plus father on many occasions. Yeah, all the while Daddy was fumbling through the sex conversation, Mom was mouthing to me, I'll talk to you later. Your parents love you, I know. Bobby dips her finger into the melting chocolate. She swirls it several times, then puts it in her mouth, laying it gently on her tongue. The best taste in the world, even when it's not in perfect shape. I disagree. Once chocolate starts to melt, it never. Another wave gushes up to the shore and splatters drops of sand and salt water on their skin. The heat instantly dries the mixture, leaving the girls looking like enticing sirens. Remember when we were in the Rocky Mountains, Jamie asked. Yeah, that anal-brained boy said, look at the lesbos. And you said, what is a lesbo? Oh, me? It seems you wanted to jump him too. Yeah, I wanted to beat all of my anger and frustration out of him. He was just mad because we didn't give in to his attempts at seducing us. I know, I was brave then. We were safe, miles away from reality. Then let's move away. Jamie lets out a long sigh, stands up and looks down at Bobby. I'm leaving. I won't wait much longer. I know. Jamie starts to walk away. She turns and says, "You're wrong, you know. Once it's melted, chocolate never returns to its former shape." Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. That was Donna Thomas reading Chocolate. Next up, we have Sean De Armand reading My Own Private Grinch, a standalone piece for Flash Fiction. Sean is a library staff member here in adult fiction. He has a full collection of short stories, sketches, and song lyrics that he plans to eventually think about possibly writing at some point, maybe. Today, he's reading My Own Private Grinch, originally meant to be a simple blog post with a couple of nods to Dr. Seuss that completely spiraled out of control. Sean was unable to be here today due to work commitments, but fortunately he was able to send me a recording of his performance, which I'll share with you guys.
Hi, I'll be reading My Own Private Grinch. Sorry about the, we gave a moose a muffin. It was Christmas in Whoville, and all through the village the stores were frenzied with stockpiles to pillage. The shops were all decked out in festive attire, with snowflakes and garlands suspended by wire. Each clerk did their work, keeping smiles in their places, with holiday stressors untouched on their faces. They rang out their welcome embracing of wallets for this'em-a-baubles and that'chamacallits. The square had its share of events for all ages, with reindeer on rooftops and skaters on stages. The ice sculptors sculpted, the carolers caroled, and kids threw their snowballs at poor Uncle Harold. And one place in town you could spend half the winter was Mark's Mega Market, your superstore center, with doors opened wide for the masses to enter, though getting back out was a bit of a splinter. Its grocery counters were filled to capacity, taking and caking for baking tenacity, mounds of Who briskets and mountains of sauces, and leaflets of lettuce for salady tosses. Who pudding, Who dressing, Who cider, you're on, stacked pies to the skies filled with peach and pecan. The feast, oh the feast, how the Who's love to feast, stuff their bellies with jellies of flour and yeast. From the west to the north and the south to the east, all the Who's would be feasting till tummies increased.
And off in the distance, a jovial Who, little Cindy Lou who is now 22, had the plate full of cookies she baked every year for a friend of the Who's who she held very dear. She tapped on his door with no hint of a warning and called to the Grinch with a chirpy, "Good morning." She heard a low shuffle of clothes and a spin, and a few moments later the door opened in. He stood there bedecked in his outfit of yore, that red Santa jacket he'd worn long before. The rim and the hem at the bottom he'd laced with a billowy cotton that covered his waist. She smiled when she saw him, the funny old Grinch, and she leaned in to give him a Christmassy clinch, and although he returned it, not pausing to flinch, he seemed to retreat, maybe just for an inch. But no matter, the Grinch had his own way of being. Today was a day full of sledding and skiing, but first Cindy Lou Who had something to do.
I brought you some cookies. I made them for you.
The Grinch took one look at the delicatessen, his semblance in icing of azure and crescent, a dozen or so little Grinchy surprises with smiles on their faces and gleams in their eyeses.
"My dear," said the Grinch, "you're so thoughtful and kind. I'm touched by your presence. Now, if you don't mind, there's a spot on the table to lay the tray down. Then we'll hop in my sled and we'll glide into town."
But, Grinch,
Cindy giggled,
they're warm and they're fresh. The dough and the icing, they perfectly mesh. So why don't you try one before we go out? I'm sure that you'll like them. I've nary a doubt.
The Grinch felt unease with the leering dessert, but his friend was aglow and had feelings to hurt. So he said,
"Don't you see, I've been stuffed on a Who tater. I'll work off that meal, and I'll save them for later."
Who tater, thought Cindy. That seemed rather odd, for this climate was hardly conducive to sod, and his claim of its stock through his foregone seclusion was giving the Who a slight touch of confusion. See, Cindy was young and a little naive. It was still in her nature to trust and believe, but her time with the Grinch made her just a bit wise. She noticed a glimmer of pain in his eyes.
Dear Grinch,
said the girl,
is there something the matter? You seem disenchanted by sight of the platter. Or have I been rude with the frosting I smatter? I meant no offense by your likeness and batter.
No, child, said the Grinch. You've impeccable skill, and I'm sorry my words have provoked an ill will, so I'm happy to try your green cookies and cream.
He grinned, and he laughed, and he stifled a scream. He lifted a pastry right up to his lips with its gooey confection and nectarous drips. The fragrant aroma infected his snout, but his jaw was determined to keep the thing out. He grinded his teeth at his troublesome stall and decided a taste wouldn't harm him at all. So simple, one bite, take the treat in and swallow. But try though he might, his mouth just wouldn't follow. He set down the cookie, this cast of himself, and he lowered his head, and he leaned on the shelf, and he slumped in his chair at a rickety slant, and he whispered to Cindy,
I'm sorry. I can't.
You can't?
Cindy said as she reached for his hand, and she patted his fingers like combing through sand.
Please tell me,
She said with the kindness of youth.
the reason you waver. Please tell me the truth.
The Grinch drew a breath like the heat of a griddle and lifted the jacket that shielded his middle and showed her his belly of fuzzy acclaim, and he grimaced and scowled and he grumbled in shame.
This stomach I carry, this pitiful waste, I cringe when I see it. This thing is disgraced. I feel like a walrus with blubber to spare, like it's building up here and it's storing up there. And I've tried to get rid of it. Surely I've tried. I've tried and I've tried and I've broke down and cried. And I stay here not eating. I curl up and hide and I bottle it up and I keep it inside.
Now, his tummy was round, but was really just fine. You'd not think such a thing could provoke this malign. But whatever the reason, his age or his stress, a feeling's a feeling they need to address. They sat there in silence, the Grinch and the Who, with neither one sure of what either should do. But Cindy leaned in with an empathy's grace, and she gave him a kiss on the side of his face.
Is it possible, Grinch, that the shape of your gain is a subtle illusion from some other pain, and it feels like a burden you're destined to halt, but it might not be swollen, or be there at all?
That doesn't make sense. I should see what I see. And the me that I see is the girth of a tree.
Sweet Grinch, what you're seeing,
The little Who said.
is anxiety speaking. It's all in your head. This fear of the size of your abdomen's border, it sounds like it's body dysmorphic disorder.
Body dysmorphic disorder, what's that? Is it cause and effect for the unwanted fat?
It's more like a filter that colors your mind by creating a flaw where there's not one to find. I know this because I have friends in the town, and each has a notion they drown in their gown. My cousin Cherie has this whimsy opaque and a dream of perfection she's trying to shake. And Ronald has talent demanding of stock that makes him a target for hecklers to mock. And then there's Melissa, whose pain as a child was to lose her regard when emotions were riled. And those memories cluster and natter their toll, and it's sad, but rejection gives guise of control. You're hearing a monster that feeds on its prey, and it's cruel and collected and won't go away. But you're never alone. There are others below, and they gather together to learn and to grow. And imagine that moment if in from the snow came the Grinch with a struggle he'd like them to know. That they reap what you reap, and they sow what you sow. And they'll listen and hear you, and comfort and cheer you, and guide you and steer you whenever you're low. For a chance to connect is a gift you bestow. If you give them a shot, oh, their faces will glow.
He ruffled the cotton from out of his lap, and he hugged Cindy tightly and balanced his cap. From Whoville below rang a gentle inviter where Christmas, somehow, felt a little bit brighter.
So that was Sean DeArmand's My Own Private Grinch. And that is the end of our Flash Fiction event, you guys. Thank you so much for being here and to share and support. The recording of this program will be up on our YouTube channel, which again, I will put in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here, and I hope to see you next month at Write Club, which will be on the second to last Saturday, because we don't want it on Halloween, at 10:30 a.m. via Zoom. Thank you.